business without China, a popular call that is gathering pace, partly because of the standoff, but partly also because of this vocal for local, and the Home Minister saying that, if 130 Indians bought Indian Swadeshi goods, then that would be a great encouragement to industry. There are two different things. One, to say that we can do without China, and another to encourage domestic industry. Can we do without China? That's the question we are asking. And joining me now is Rajiv Bajaj, Managing Director, Bajaj Auto. Rajiv, thank you very much for joining me. A lot of countries are trying to look at self-reliance, but can we even contemplate business without China as a strategy?
Well, Lata, the other day I heard, although I am not part of CII, I'm not a member, but I heard that the Prime Minister laid out a vision for 5 eyes at a CII meeting. So taking a cue from that, let me tell you how I interpret this China issue in terms of the 5 C's that make up China. The first C for me, confusion. And let me tell you what I mean by that. In Pune today, I have 2 friends, one of whom is Samuel from the Northeast, and the other is Dr. Pasang from Tibet. Samuel runs a lovely spa, and Dr. Pasang is an outstanding acupuncturist. Not only business is flattened by this lockdown, but both of them are very apprehensive about getting back to work because they think that they and their staff is looked upon as quote-unquote Chinese. This may be a small issue for those of us sitting in our ivory towers, but it's a big issue for people on the ground because these are not Chinese, these are Indians. And if we are not careful, this will become our equivalent of the Black Lives Matter. So that's the first issue to my mind. The second issue is that of continuity. What I mean by this is that Bajaj last year imported directly about 600 crores worth of components from China. It makes up between 3 and 4% of our material cost. Maybe an equal amount comes through our suppliers, our tier 1 suppliers, who in turn purchase from China. So, the overall import bill from China for someone like us could well be about 1,000 crores of rupees. Now, these are components that we've been sourcing from there for a long time. The number 1 import is that of alloy wheels that go into the motorcycle. And this is not just for Bajaj, this is pretty much for the entire industry. And then there are transmission parts, and then there are other parts. So what I mean by continuity is this: we have friends who are our suppliers in China who have invested a lot of time, effort, and money in supplying us not a vicious virus, but some wonderful wheels, very, very reliably for years, maybe for the last 15 years, if not longer. How do we suddenly let them down, even if we could? Is that ethical? Is that what we would like to stand for, whether as a company or a country? We have to ask ourselves. The third C to my mind is that of competitiveness. The reason we source these components from China is quite simply because China is more competitive. Now, by that, I do not mean that our Indian suppliers are dumb. They are not. In fact, we are handicapped by what I like to refer to as the 5 L's over here: the issues of land, labor, logistics, legislation, and electricity, so to speak. So it is because of these unease of doing business, if you may call it that, for components like this, which in our language are called non-proprietary components, we find that the Chinese source is more competitive. And that is why we import from China. So it might look like we are importing 1,000 crores worth of stuff from China. But let's not forget that Bajaj is a company that exports motorcycles and 3-wheelers worth about 15,000 crores every year. Last year, that is what our exports were. Yeah. So this import makes us competitive and helps us export what we do. Half the people in Bajaj and its supply chain are employed just to make stuff that we export. So I would say that there is a lot of merit in importing from China, that which comes very competitively from China. And fourthly and finally, I have to make a somewhat intangible point for the C of completeness.
Okay.
You know, what I mean is this, that when you're a global company, it doesn't mean that you are just going to sell across the world. I think it also means that you will source from across the world. Global sourcing is intrinsic to your strategy. It means you will have people working with you from around the world. It was wonderful last week when I was at our design studio twice. I was sitting there amongst Indian engineers, but we were connected with our design colleagues who are Italian, who are Korean, who are Japanese. And it is by this learning, you know, this global learning, knowledge sharing, brainstorming of ideas that we evolve and we are a better company. So, you know, how can one be a global company without being complete? I don't understand. So these are the first 4 of the 5 C's, I would say, that we need to ponder over.
Oh, that's a fair point. But, you know, you spoke about competitiveness. You know, just a little while, I think a couple of days back, a former Bajaj Auto employee had contributed a column to CNBC TV 18 where he points out that the two-wheeler industry has been able to beat China both in India and in many countries in the world. So even with our current milieu of all the 4 L's you point out, land, labor, legislation and electricity, it has been able to beat. Why is it that some industries beat and some don't?
This was written by our ex-head of HR, Srini. I have seen the article you mentioned, and I think, to put it very simply, the answer is focus. You know, I've said this before, that a lot of Indian companies are very vocal about global, but their actions are local. Okay. For a company like us, you know, local really means the world, because we look at the world as our oyster when it comes to our motorcycles and three-wheelers. And we started down this path of being a global company 15 years ago with a very sharp focus that we want to be the quote-unquote best, most complete, most versatile motorcycle maker in the world, who can make a Boxer for Africa for as little as $400 and also a KTM for Europe for as much as 4,000 euros. Now, when you want to achieve this kind of scale, it doesn't matter whether you are McDonald's or Starbucks, it doesn't matter whether you are Bajaj or KTM. You have to specialize. You have to be really good at doing one thing very well. So what Srini's article is really pointing out is the power of focus. You know, my marketing guru, Jack Trout, always told me that whenever you are in trouble, whenever you have a difficulty, whenever you are challenged by something, the first marketing mantra to keep in mind is narrow your focus. Less is more. What we are seeing today is unfortunately a lot of companies pursuing the more is more strategy, because the domestic market is so large that it gives them the hope that they can be a large company, whatever that means, by entering multiple segments which are not relevant or harmonious with their core competency. Well, we never wanted to be a large company. We wanted to be an excellent company. We want to be a global company. And I think it is that focus that has helped us deliver in the manner that Srini has described. Okay.
You're telling a profession where amateurism is very common. We spread ourselves thin. I wish we had the luxury of specializing. But anyway, that's a separate discussion. To be fair to the government, it's not as if anybody in government have spoken about boycott China. This seems to be more a popular view. The two important government leaders, the Prime Minister has spoken about vocal for local, not anti somebody, and the Home Minister also said that if Indians bought Indian goods, that would be a boost to manufacturing. So they're not saying anti anybody. But the effort also is to attract business from China. And in the process, we thought if we walked out of RCEP, we will sign an FTA. We haven't done that. Vietnam has beaten us to that as well. So, what should be the focus of policymakers in terms of, not boycotting, but doing better?
I am not, knowledgeable enough to say too much on that. But I would again point out these 5 L's. I would say that Bajaj Bajaj would be far more competitive if some of these issues, which are time-honored pains that we face in doing business in terms of land, labor, logistics, legislation, electricity, are sorted out, particularly so for the MSME, many of whom are our suppliers, because this brings in a lot of cost and complexity into the business. I mean, I have always believed that there is very little the government can do right in terms of making you more competitive. That is up to your strategy, your skills. But the government can, and any government, not just our government, can do a lot of stuff wrong. So I think they need to focus less on the ease of doing business. They need to focus more on the removal of all the dis-ease of doing business that is there, which we are all very well aware of. And they need to do so without swinging from one extreme to the other. I mean, example basis recent events would be what we have attempted to do with labor laws. I am of the view that some states have gone too far in throwing the baby out with the bathwater, implying that you can almost hire and fire at will. You are not obliged to provide any decent working conditions. And in a case of any disputes, no industrial disputes will be entertained for a certain period of time. So I think this does not really help us to move forward, because world-class companies and world-class products are created basis world-class employees and world-class policies. And that brings me actually to the fifth C, the C of compassion. I mean, in the end, I would say to those who are misinterpreting the message of the Prime Minister, perhaps, that, the success of India is not a nirbhar on the failure of China. We will succeed in our own way, on our own terms. We do not have to wish for China to fail. We do not have to stand tall by trampling upon China. We can do it in a positive way by elevating ourselves, and in that process, we actually need to learn from China. I mean, it's a huge country with some very fine skills. A lot of our suppliers, for example, are more competitive today because of the exposure they have had to their Chinese counterparts. So, in the end, we have to accept that we are one world, and we cannot run away from the interdependence of being part of one world.
Yep. Once again, I mean, I must admit that this is not stated political policy. It seems to be just more a populist cry or a popular cry. But, since I have you, I don't want to not ask you a question which, I did ask you about 10 days ago. But nevertheless, any update on have things improved in terms of demand? A few more retail outlets may have opened. Is there any improvement, at least in terms of demand and, for that matter, even supply? Are logistics and labor falling into place?
Well, I must confess that I do not have the update in the last few days, but I would say this. From what I know, demand is picking up nicely. I have always been saying that for various reasons, ranging from the coming back of suppressed demand to perhaps a kind of structural change in demand from public to private transport, I have believed that the recovery will be more V-shaped than any other shape. And I think we are seeing that. To tell you very specifically, I think demand is now back at about 2/3 of what I would call normal demand, and by which I mean demand before BS6, when we were selling BS4 vehicles. Yeah. So I think that's pretty good. In the month of June, if we are going to witness 66% of the normal demand level, that's pretty good. We are able to meet that with production. So we can say that the supply chain is also up to about 66% capacity. And I'm quite happy with this because it has taken a huge effort on the part of everyone, to get the dealerships going, to get the suppliers going, to get the labor back, etc. And if it continues like this, I would hazard that in a month or two, barring something unforeseen, we should be back in a good situation for the time being. Now, how far this sustains, I do not know. And that is why, despite this relatively positive picture, I would still urge the government to look at some of the things we have been talking about, which is the insurance cost, the cost of safety and emission regulations, all this cost of over-regulation. I continue to think this is important now, whether they do it by changing the regulation, by reduction of GST, as they've done for electric vehicles, is only 5% versus 28%. It's really their choice. But I do not believe it is prudent to wait. I mean, I don't understand. When it comes to declaring a lockdown, we give the people 4 hours notice. That time, there is no worry about being in a hurry. But when it comes to restoring lives to normalcy, we think haste makes waste. And we must wait and see how people save or do not and how the supply chain responds. I find this quite difficult to comprehend.
Okay, all right. But you still leave us with a lot of optimism, Rajiv Bajaj. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's good to hear that demand is picking up. 2/3 of demand back, that itself is very positive news. Well, on the issue of business without China, India Inc., the magnates whom we have spoken to so far are leaving us with similar messages. One, let's not think in terms of boycott and negativity, not in an interlinked world. Let us think in terms of one world where we can show our strengths with our competitiveness. So doing things better than China or better than any other country is better than to keep someone out. And while we think of ease of doing business, let us also think of removing things that make for dis-ease or discomfort in business. So some bad ideas removed and some good ideas on the table at the end of this conversation. Thank you very much for joining us in this chat, but do keep it with CNBC TV 18 after this break. There is more lined up for you.